They found a bullet fragment in his testicle. 47 years after he'd been shot in Vietnam, a war wound that no one, not even he, knew was still inside him. But that was just the beginning. A hidden letter, a lifelong secret, and the truth that nearly broke him turned out to be the one thing that set him free. If you believe real stories can change lives, hit subscribe and turn on the bell. You won't want to miss what comes next. I always believe that age brings predictability, a sense of peace, familiarity. That's what they say about the golden years, don't they? But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the moment I saw Raymond hunched over in the bathroom, his face pale, his hands clutching his lower abdomen like something was about to explode inside him. "Ray?" I called from the hallway, heart thudding against my ribs. He didn't respond, just a low grunt. I rushed in, and there he was, sitting on the edge of the tub, his breath ragged, sweat pooling on his temples despite the chill of a Montana winter sneaking in through the cracked window. "Is it your stomach again?" I asked, kneeling in front of him. "No," he said, shaking his head. "Lower." That's when I saw it, the bulge. At first, I didn't know what I was looking at. I mean, we've been married for over 40 years. There's nothing I haven't seen, nothing that could still shock me. Until that morning, both testicles swollen, not just slightly. They looked like 2 tennis balls trapped inside his body. "We're going to the doctor," I said. No room for argument. He tried to protest. Said it was probably just a pulled muscle, or maybe he sat wrong while cleaning the gutters last weekend. But deep down, I could hear something different in his voice, something uncertain. Raymond was never afraid of pain, not even during the worst of the winters or when his shoulder still acted up from the war. But this was different. We got to the local clinic just after noon. Snow was falling in soft curtains by then, blanketing everything in white, like the world wanted to cover us in silence. The waiting room was quiet, save for the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional rustle of a magazine page. The doctor, a young man named Leary who probably hadn't seen a war wound outside of textbooks, did the exam with surprising gentleness. He didn't say much, just nodded, made a few notes, then ordered an ultrasound and some blood work. Back in the car, Raymond stayed silent. He didn't complain, didn't curse the cold or the system or the wait like he usually did. He just stared ahead, as if trying to remember something long buried. That night, I barely slept. I lay there next to him, listening to the uneven rhythm of his breathing. I reached out once, placed my hand on his chest. He took my hand in his own but said nothing. I thought of cancer. Testicular, maybe? At his age, it was rare, but not impossible. We'd lost 2 friends in the past 5 years to prostate complications. I prayed it wasn't the same path. I told myself we'd caught it early, that it would be fine, but still, fear bloomed in my stomach like ivy, growing quietly in the dark. The next morning, the clinic called. They were referring us to the regional hospital in Billings. Said the ultrasound showed something unusual. Unusual? It's a strange word, isn't it? Not dangerous, not urgent, just different. It only made things worse. We made the drive to Billings on a Wednesday. The road was slick, the air dry and bitter. Raymond drove the first half in silence, then handed me the wheel without a word. When we got to the hospital, they sent us straight to imaging. Another scan, another wait. Then finally, a doctor in a white coat came in with a tablet in hand, his brow furrowed. "There's a foreign object in the left testicle," he said. "Looks metallic." I blinked. "What?" Raymond stared at the screen without a word. The image showed a small, bright speck, a glint of metal inside soft tissue. The doctor continued. "It's roughly 1.5 centimeters in length. We'll need to do more imaging to confirm, but it appears to be a piece of shrapnel." My heart stopped. "From where?" I asked. Raymond was still silent. The doctor looked at us and asked gently, "Mr. Harris, have you ever been injured in combat?" Raymond finally spoke, his voice low. "Vietnam. 1974. Took a bullet to the shoulder." "And they removed the fragments then?" the doctor asked. "They said they did," Raymond replied. The room went quiet. I reached for his hand again, and this time, he held on tight. The doctor stepped out to make a phone call, leaving us alone in that quiet room with its pale green walls and the sound of Raymond's breath, steady but shallow. I looked at the monitor again, that little white glint, like a sliver of metal trapped in darkness. "Are you okay?" I asked softly. He didn't answer right away, just looked down at his hands. Those hands had once lifted beams to build our porch, repaired engines, skinned deer, and held our babies when they cried. but now they just rested on his lap like something foreign to him. Finally, he said, "I haven't thought about Vietnam in years. Maybe it's time," I whispered. An hour later, a specialist came in. A tall woman named Dr. Langford, with short gray hair and glasses perched halfway down her nose. She looked like someone who didn't bother much with small talk. "I've reviewed the scans," she began, swiping across her tablet. "There's definitely a metallic object lodged inside the left testicle. It's positioned deep within the tissue, likely encapsulated over time by scar tissue. It hasn't shifted recently, which is probably why it's only now starting to cause discomfort. Your body's inflammatory response has increased." Raymond blinked slowly. "So, what is it? A bullet?" "Not a full bullet," she replied. "It's too small. More likely a fragment." "Shrapnel." Raymond leaned back slightly, a slow breath leaving his lips. "Jesus." Dr. Langford turned the screen toward us. We ran a density scan. Based on the material and the shape, it's likely a piece of metal consistent with older military-grade munitions, not modern materials, possibly steel or brass. I looked at Raymond, then back at her. "But how could that, how does something like that get there?" "It doesn't migrate on its own," she said. Unless it entered the body somewhere else, and moved over time. Slowly. Very slowly." Raymond rubbed the scar on his left shoulder, a faded white line I'd traced with my fingers more times than I could count. "I was shot in '74. They said they removed everything." Langford nodded slowly. "I've seen cases, rare but not impossible, where tiny fragments weren't detected, especially with older imaging technology. Over decades, if small enough, those fragments can shift position due to gravity, muscle movement, and tissue displacement." I stared at her. "You're saying it's been in his body for nearly 50 years? She met my eyes. "Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying." For a moment, everything in the room faded, just a low ringing in my ears. I looked at Raymond, who was still staring at the image on the screen. It was as if he'd turned to stone. "I thought it was gone," he muttered. "All of it. Left behind with the uniform." Dr. Langford leaned forward, more gentle now. "We'll run an MRI to assess if there's any vascular involvement or nerve compression. Right now, we don't think it's cancer, but the inflammation is real, and if left untreated, it could lead to complications, abscess, infection, even necrosis." That word, necrosis, sent a chill down my spine. "Would you remove it?" I asked. "If we can access it safely," she said. "Yes. But surgery in that area, especially at your husband's age, carries risks. Bleeding, infection, and anesthesia concerns." Raymond was silent again. I could tell he was in two places, half in this room, half back in the jungle where it all started. After the doctor left, I helped him dress. We didn't say much. It felt like speaking would crack open something fragile between us. In the parking lot, wind blew fiercely across the lot, dusting the windshield with snow. I turned on the heater. Raymond didn't start the engine. "I remember the noise," he said finally. "The gunfire, the heat, the way my shoulder exploded. And Eddie, he was there. He pulled me out." I said nothing. "They said they got it all," he continued. "I remember the surgery, in some tent hospital near Pleiku. The doctor looked 19, I was 22 and felt like 1,000. I reached over and squeezed his hand. "You're not alone in this." He nodded, eyes on the dashboard. But part of me always wondered why that shoulder ached in the winter more than it should, why it felt unfinished. I could feel my throat tighten. He'd never talked this much about the war. "Not in 4 decades. Maybe your body never forgot," I said softly. He turned to look at me, really look. Maybe I didn't either. We drove back in silence. I didn't push. I just let him be. That night, as we sat at the kitchen table, sipping tea, he brought out an old shoebox. The cardboard was worn, edges taped together. He opened it slowly. Inside were yellowed photos, dog tags, a letter with faded ink, and a folded bandana, stained dark with something that had once been red. "I haven't opened this in years," he said. "Why now?" He hesitated. "Because something old just showed up in my body. Maybe it's time to face what's old in my mind, too." I nodded, blinking back tears. Raymond picked up a photo. 2 young men in fatigues, arms slung around each other. One of them was Raymond. The other, I assumed, was Eddie. He placed it on the table gently, like it might shatter. "Eddie saved my life," he said. "That day I was shot, he dragged me out of the firefight, stayed with me until the evac came." My voice caught. "Do you think he knew that something was left inside you?" He shook his head. No, I don't think anyone knew. Not then, not even me. I reached for the photo, running my fingers across its surface. Maybe now's the time to find out more. Raymond didn't reply, but I saw something change in his face. Not fear, not regret, something closer to resolve. It was always hot in Pleiku. A suffocating heat that clung to the skin and filled your lungs with damp, heavy air. Even the shadows sweated. On that day, April 23, 1974, I remember the sky being the color of old coins, heavy with the promise of a storm but refusing to rain. Raymond stood with his platoon just outside the perimeter of a rural village. Intelligence said it had been cleared, but intelligence always said that. They moved in quietly, boots barely making a sound over the cracked soil. The jungle was tight here, green walls closing in, and the silence was wrong. Not peaceful, just waiting. Raymond held his M16 close, his eyes darting from tree to tree. Eddie was on his left, same as always. They didn't talk during patrols, but they had their rhythm. Eddie would glance, Raymond would nod. That was all they needed. Then came the sound. Not a shot, at least not at first. It was more like a crack, a whip of air, then a hiss, then chaos. Bullets tore through the tree line. A claymore mine went off behind them, flinging red mud and shrapnel into the air. Someone screamed. Another soldier fell, his helmet rolling toward Raymond's feet. Raymond tried to run for cover, but the force hit him hard in the shoulder, a white-hot explosion of pain that knocked him flat onto his back. For a moment, he couldn't hear anything, just his own breathing, like wind through broken glass. Then Eddie was there, shouting something, his hands pressing down on Raymond's shoulder, blood everywhere. Raymond's own voice rose, not in fear, but in rage. He wasn't ready to die. Not here, not like this. Stay with me, Ray. Stay awake. Eddie's voice cut through the fog. He was half carried, half dragged behind a mound of dirt. Eddie pulled out a field dressing, his fingers fumbling with the gauze. Raymond could feel his own blood pooling beneath him, soaking into the earth. Tell my mom, he started, but Eddie snapped. Shut up. You're not dying. Not today. The world pulsed in and out of focus. Helicopter blades in the distance, the ground shaking with every explosion. The pain spread from his shoulder down to his ribs, a red-hot current that made it hard to breathe. When the chopper arrived, Eddie helped load him in. Raymond's last image before passing out was Eddie standing in the open, firing cover rounds into the jungle, his mouth open in a war cry. Then, blackness. Raymond awoke to the sound of buzzing. Not gunfire, not helicopters. A light hum, like fluorescent lights vibrating above his head. The air was thick with antiseptic, and everything smelled of metal and gauze. He blinked against the harsh brightness. A canvas ceiling, canvas walls, a fan spinning slow overhead, a field hospital. He was alive. The left side of his body throbbed like a second heartbeat. His shoulder was bandaged tight, painkillers dulling the worst of it, but leaving behind a heavy ache. A young man in green scrubs approached, barely old enough to shave, let alone hold a scalpel. You're awake, the medic said, scribbling something on a clipboard. You're lucky. That was a nasty wound. Shrapnel mostly. Couple of pieces lodged in the deltoid. We got them out. Raymond tried to speak, but his throat felt like sandpaper. The medic offered him water from a canteen. After a few sips, he asked, "How many pieces?" "Two confirmed," the medic replied. "We think that's all." The X-ray wasn't perfect. Some fragments can be microscopic. But you're stable. That's what counts. Raymond nodded slowly, though the words "we think" lodged in his mind like a splinter. He stayed in the makeshift ward for 5 more days. The doctors came and went, more focused on logistics than healing. They packed him with antibiotics, redressed his wounds, and gave him discharge papers when the bleeding stopped. Among those papers was a typed summary of his injury: gunshot wound to the left shoulder, debridement performed, 2 metallic fragments removed, no additional foreign bodies noted. The final line, written in pen, read, "Small residual artifact possible, non-threatening." He didn't notice that line until years later. At the time, all that mattered was that he could walk, that he wasn't going home in a body bag. Eddie visited him on the last day, brought him a chocolate bar and a wrinkled pack of cigarettes. "You scared the hell out of me, man," Eddie said, sitting beside his cot. "I scared myself," Raymond rasped. They didn't talk about the firefight, or the blood, or the scream that Raymond later realized had been his own. Instead, they smoked in silence. Back in the States, Raymond carried that silence with him. The wound healed, the scar turned white, but the ache in his shoulder stayed, just beneath the skin, just beneath memory. Doctors over the years said it was arthritis, weather sensitivity, Nerve damage, nothing serious. But sometimes, especially in the dead of winter, Raymond would lie in bed and feel something shift deep inside his arm, like a ghost curling up to sleep beside the bone. He never told anyone, not even me. Dr. Langford entered the exam room holding a folder, though most of the information had already been sent electronically. Still, something about the physical folder, the worn manila color, the slight curve from use, made it feel more official, more permanent. She sat across from us, her expression serious but not unkind. "We've completed the MRI," she began, "and we've confirmed the object is metallic. Based on its composition, shape, and the surrounding tissue, we believe it has been in Mr. Harris's body for decades." Raymond sat still, hands clasped between his knees. I could feel the tension in him, like a coiled wire waiting to snap. "How?" I asked. Dr. Langford turned the screen toward us again, this time showing a digital model of Raymond's body, highlighting the original injury site in the shoulder and the current location of the fragment. "This is where you were shot," she said, tapping the screen. "Deltoid region. There's scarring there, visible even after all these years, and this," she tapped lower, closer to the pelvis, "is where the fragment ended up." She leaned back. "Now, here's the remarkable part. Soft tissue, over time, can carry small objects, especially if the object is not causing an acute immune response. In rare cases, the body essentially tolerates the foreign material, encapsulates it in scar tissue. Then, over years, sometimes decades, gravity and natural motion do the rest." "You're saying it moved?" Raymond asked. "Yes," she said simply. "Like a slow river carving through rock. Every movement you made, every step, every stretch, every lift, tiny shifts in the muscle layers and fascia, gravity working quietly, and over 47 years the path formed, bit by bit." He looked down at his lap. His fingers twitched. Dr. Langford added, "There are recorded cases, not many. A few in medical literature, metal fragments traveling from chest to abdomen, even down to limbs. But I've never seen one travel this far, or for this long." I spoke before I could stop myself. "It's been inside him all this time. And no one knew?" "It's not that uncommon," she replied. "Especially with older combat wounds. Imaging in the 70s wasn't what it is now. If the fragment was small and not causing immediate danger, they may have assumed it wasn't worth chasing." "They told me they got it all," Raymond said, his voice flat. "I believe they thought they did," she answered gently. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything she had said. He stood up and walked slowly to the window. The hospital lawn below was covered in snow, unbroken and white, except for a single path of footprints leading to the main entrance. "It's strange," he said finally. "You think you've left something behind. A war, a place, a memory. But your body, it keeps records." I looked at him, then at the doctor. "Is it dangerous now?" I asked. "That depends," she said. "It's causing inflammation, swelling, some pressure on the surrounding vessels. If left alone, it could lead to infection, or worse. But it's not cancer. That's the good news." Raymond turned back to us, eyes clearer now. "So I carried a piece of war inside me all these years," he said, "and didn't even know it." Dr. Langford nodded. "Yes, and now your body is asking you to let it go." The drive home was quiet. Raymond didn't turn on the radio like he usually did. The snowy landscape outside our windshield passed by in silence, the bare trees leaning into the cold wind like thin, exhausted men. I glanced at him a few times, but he kept his eyes on the road, his jaw set, one hand resting on the steering wheel, while the other stayed clenched in his lap. There was something about his stillness that unnerved me more than anything the doctor had said. When we got back to the house, he went straight to the shed. I watched from the kitchen window as he stood there, just inside the doorway, not moving. After a while, he sat on the old workbench, elbows on knees, head down like he was waiting for something to come out of the shadows. I made tea. Strong, black, hot enough to scald the tongue. The kind he liked in winter. He came back in eventually, smelling faintly of cedar and cold air. He didn't say anything, just sat at the kitchen table and wrapped both hands around the mug like he was trying to warm more than his fingers. "Does it feel strange?" I asked. He looked up. "What? To know that it was there all this time?" He thought about it for a long moment. "No," he said slowly. "Not strange. Familiar. That caught me off guard. I've always had a weight in me," he continued. "I thought it was just the memories, the pain, but maybe it was this. Maybe my body knew something I didn't. I sat across from him, staring into his face. His eyes were tired, but not broken, just older. Like he'd spent the last few days catching up with a version of himself that had been waiting in the dark for decades. "You ever wonder," he said, voice low, "how many pieces of us are still stuck back there, in that jungle, with the people who never came home?" I nodded, my throat tight. "I think part of me never left," he said. "And that part, it's what kept that thing moving, like it was trying to get somewhere." "To where?" I whispered. He didn't answer right away. "Then, to where it could finally be noticed." I reached across the table and took his hand. His skin was warm, calloused from years of labor and life, but underneath that was something tender, something raw. "You think you're ready to let it go?" I asked. "I don't know," he said, "but I think my body is." We sat like that for a while. No need for more words, just the soft hum of the heater and the faint ticking of the old kitchen clock. Later that evening, he pulled out an old notebook, the kind he used to carry in his breast pocket during deployment. The pages were brittle, yellowed, but still held the pressure of past writing, indentations of names, coordinates, dates, and numbers. He thumbed through them until he stopped at a torn page, blank, except for a single note at the bottom. "E.H. April 23. Never forget." "Eddie," I said. He nodded. "The day I got hit." He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. There was a ghost between us now, not one that haunted, but one that remembered. And somewhere deep in his body, a sliver of metal that had journeyed for nearly half a century was finally ready to come out. It started with a sound I'd never heard from him before. A groan, sharp and guttural, like something tearing loose inside. I jolted awake to find Raymond doubled over at the foot of the bed, one hand gripping the edge of the mattress, the other pressed against his lower abdomen. "Raymond?" I was already out of bed, heart thudding. "What's wrong?" He couldn't speak. His face was gray, the skin around his eyes tight with pain. He was sweating, drenched through his t-shirt, and when I touched his back, it was cold and clammy. "We need to go," I said, grabbing his coat. "Now." The drive to the hospital was a blur of snow and adrenaline. He didn't argue, didn't even speak, just sat hunched in the passenger seat, eyes closed, breathing through clenched teeth. At the ER, they took him in fast. One look at his vitals and the swelling, and everything moved quickly. IVs, scans, blood work. I was left alone in the fluorescent waiting room, my fingers wrapped tight around a paper coffee cup I never drank from. Dr. Langford came out within the hour, her face grave. "We have to operate," she said. "The fragment is causing acute inflammation. His body is rejecting it, possibly now breaking down the scar tissue surrounding it. There's fluid buildup, pressure on vessels, and signs of early necrosis in the surrounding tissue." I stared at her, trying to absorb each terrifying word. "Necrosis?" "Tissue death," she said gently. "If we wait, the infection could spread. This needs to come out, now." "And the risks?" She hesitated, which was worse than if she'd answered quickly. "He's 70. There are cardiovascular concerns. We'll monitor everything closely, but I won't lie to you. It's not without danger, especially under anesthesia." I nodded, throat too tight to speak. She handed me a clipboard, a consent form. "If anything happens, we'll call you immediately," she said. Raymond was already being prepped. They allowed me a minute to see him. He was on the gurney, eyes half-lidded but awake. Machines beeped steadily around him, and nurses moved with controlled urgency. "Looks like I can't keep ignoring it anymore," he said, managing a thin smile. "You're going to be fine," I told him, brushing back his damp hair. He studied my face like he was trying to memorize it. "If I don't come out, just know—" He started, but I cut him off. "Don't you dare finish that sentence." He gave a faint laugh. "Bossy till the end." I kissed his forehead and squeezed his hand. And then they wheeled him away, and I was left with only silence and the cold, sterile smell of antiseptic on my skin. I sat in the waiting room for what felt like hours. The walls didn't move. The chairs were hard. A vending machine hummed faintly in the corner. Nurses passed through like ghosts, never stopping. I prayed. I bargained. I replayed every moment of the past week in my head like a tape I couldn't pause. And then the doors swung open, and Dr. Langford stepped out. But this time, something in her eyes was different. Dr. Langford didn't speak right away. She walked slowly toward me, her expression careful, composed, but her eyes told the story before her mouth did. "There was a complication," she began, "during the extraction. My legs turned to water. I gripped the edge of the reception counter to stay upright. We located the fragment," she said. It was embedded deep, surrounded by inflamed tissue, pressing against a minor vein. As we maneuvered to remove it, his blood pressure dropped, fast. Her voice lowered, gentled. He went into cardiac arrest. We lost him, for about 30 seconds. The world narrowed to that number. 30 seconds. 30. Just long enough to fall off a cliff. Just long enough to lose everything. But we got him back, she said quickly, firmly. CPR was successful. Epinephrine worked. His heart is stable now. We've got him in recovery and we're monitoring everything. I couldn't breathe. Relief and terror slammed into each other in my chest like waves. I covered my mouth with both hands, tears spilling out before I could stop them. The fragment, I whispered. Dr. Langford nodded and held up a small sterile cup. Inside it, resting on a cotton square, was the matted gray shard. It looked unimpressive, like a broken piece of pencil lead, but its edges were jagged. It had weight. This caused the inflammation? I asked. This, she said softly, has been in his body for 47 years. His tissue had grown around it like armor, but eventually, even the strongest tissue gives out. I stared at it, imagining that tiny piece of war living under Raymond's skin all that time, moving silently, slowly burrowing its way from shoulder to pelvis like it had a mission of its own. When can I see him? I asked. In a few minutes. He's sedated but stable. She placed the cup gently on the counter. You can keep it, if you'd like. Most families do. The phrase struck me as absurd, a souvenir from the brink of death, a relic of pain, but I took it. When they let me into recovery, the room was dim, and everything beeped softly. Raymond lay beneath a pale blue blanket, oxygen tubes in his nose, a line of machines tracking every beat of his battered heart. I sat beside him, reached for his hand. It was warm, alive. I told you not to finish that sentence, I whispered. His eyes fluttered open, groggy, unfocused at first. Then they found me. You're still here, he murmured. Of course I am, I said, tears running down again, this time quietly, without shame. He didn't speak for a while, just breathed, slow and shallow. His fingers tightened around mine. Then, in a raspy voice, It's out? It's out, I confirmed. The doctor says you scared the hell out of everyone. A faint smile flickered on his lips. What else is new? I reached into my pocket and pulled out the tiny plastic cup. He looked at it, then back at me. That little bastard, he whispered. Almost took you twice, I said. His smile faded, replaced by something quieter. He stared at the fragment as if recognizing it, not as an object, but as a memory, as a ghost finally made flesh. Feels lighter, he said. And in that moment I realized it wasn't just his body that was healing. It was everything else too. The second night after surgery, Raymond finally slept through until morning. He didn't toss or groan, no cold sweats, no sudden jolts awake like a man trying to outrun a memory. Just a slow, steady breath under warm blankets, machines humming like quiet reassurance in the background. I stayed beside him the whole night, in a stiff hospital chair with a scratchy wool blanket across my lap, but I didn't mind. Watching him breathe, knowing he was still here, that was enough. At sunrise he stirred. His eyelids fluttered open, and for a few seconds he looked around like he wasn't sure where he was. Then he saw me and smiled. You were talking in your sleep, I told him gently. I was? Yeah. You said a name. He blinked. Whose? Eddie. He went quiet for a moment, then slowly nodded. I saw him, he whispered, in a dream, clear as day. I leaned forward. What happened? Raymond closed his eyes again, as if replaying it in his mind. We were back in the jungle, the same ridge outside Pleiku, only it wasn't like before. The air wasn't heavy, it was still, clean. And Eddie, he wasn't in fatigues, he was just standing there, no gear, no gun, just waiting. He paused. I said nothing. He looked at me and smiled. Raymond continued, said, You made it out, good. Then he pointed at my chest and said, You've been carrying me long enough. His hand moved to rest on his abdomen, where the fragment had once been. Then he walked away. Didn't say goodbye, just faded into the trees. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around the edge of the blanket. He saved your life, I said, back then. Yeah, Raymond replied, and maybe again now. For the rest of the morning he drifted in and out of sleep, but peacefully this time. No more murmurs, no more ghosts. When he finally dozed off for good, I stepped out of the room. Something about that dream lingered in my mind, not just the imagery, but the tone in his voice, like a door had opened inside him that had been sealed shut for decades. I thought back to that old shoebox, the one with the photos and the letter he'd shown me after the first scans. I remembered something odd, how when he lifted it, it made a dull clunk at the bottom, like there was something heavier beneath the usual paper and fabric. When I got home later that day, I went straight to the hall closet, moved past coats, winter boots, and the red cooler we used only once a year. The shoebox was on the top shelf, exactly where we left it. I brought it to the dining table, set it down gently, and opened the lid. Photos. Dog tags, the bandana, a few coins and a lighter engraved with the Marine Corps emblem, and under all of it, the letter we'd already read, but that clunk was still in my mind. I tilted the box sideways, nothing shifted. Then I noticed a seam, barely visible, along the bottom of the box. A false bottom. My breath caught. Carefully, I wedged my fingernail under the edge and lifted. There, tucked inside a shallow hidden compartment, was a second envelope. The envelope was thin, yellowed, the edges curled like leaves in late fall. My fingers trembled as I lifted it out of the false bottom. No name on the front, just a smudge of old ink. The paper was soft with time, worn at the folds, but the seal had never been broken. I hesitated. Then slowly I opened it. Inside was a single page, written in blue ink that had faded into slate. The handwriting was jagged, rushed, almost frantic, but unmistakably human. It began without greeting. April 25, 1974, Ray. I don't know if you'll ever read this. Maybe I'll never give it to you. Maybe I'm writing it for myself, because I don't know how else to carry what happened. That night on the ridge, I thought I saw movement in the brush. I was on edge. We all were. Everything was shadows and sound. And then I turned and saw something move behind me, fast. I didn't think, I just fired. And then you screamed. I stopped reading, my breath caught, my hands shook. I forced myself to keep going. It took me a second, maybe less, to realize it was you. You doubled back to signal. I didn't know. God, Ray, I didn't know. I ran to you. I held your shoulder. I told you it was going to be okay. But I think part of me already knew what I'd done. They said it was shrapnel. They said the angle made sense. They didn't question it. And you didn't remember, but I did. I wanted to tell you, every damn day. But I couldn't. Not when you were healing. Not when we shipped back. Not when you started talking about leaving it all behind. So I wrote this. I figured someday, maybe, if the moment came, I'd have the courage. Maybe I still will. But if not, please know this. I never meant to hurt you. You were my brother, still are, and I would have taken that bullet for you 100 times if I could. Forgive me if you can, Eddie. I read it twice, then a third time. Each word landed like a heartbeat, soft but impossible to ignore. This wasn't just a letter, it was a confession, a wound that had never been stitched shut. I folded the paper back carefully, gently, like it might break. My fingers brushed the edges, remembering how often I'd heard Raymond speak Eddie's name like a prayer, not knowing this truth had lived just inches beneath his memory all these years. I stared at the envelope, this secret buried beneath cardboard and dust, and felt the shape of something new forming between past and present. A bridge. That night, I returned to the hospital. Raymond was sleeping again, more color in his face now. I slipped the envelope into my purse, unsure whether I'd show it to him. Not yet, but I sat by his side, holding his hand, and whispered to the room, to no one, to Eddie. He'll know. When the time is right. Raymond was sitting up when I entered the hospital room the next morning. The color had returned to his face, and though he moved slowly, his eyes were clear, sharper than they had been in days. I had another dream, he said before I even sat down. Yeah? He nodded. This time I wasn't in the jungle. I was on a porch, somewhere quiet, mountains in the distance, and Eddie was sitting across from me. No words, just presence. I smiled softly. Sounds peaceful. It was. I hesitated, then reached into my bag. My fingers brushed the edge of the envelope before I pulled it free and set it on the tray beside his bed. I found something, I said. He looked at the envelope like it was radioactive. What is it? From Eddie, I said. It was in the box. Hidden. I think he meant to give it to you. But never did. Raymond didn't touch it at first, just stared. Then after a long moment, he picked it up with both hands and unfolded the page. I watched his eyes move slowly across each line. He didn't blink much. His jaw clenched once, then again. When he reached the end, he folded the paper along its original creases, set it on his lap, and stared at the wall. The silence stretched. I waited. I don't remember that moment, he said finally, not like he described it. I always assumed it came from the other side, the ridge, enemy fire. Never once thought. He trailed off. It doesn't change what he did afterward, I said softly. He saved you. He nodded once, then looked down at his hands. I always wondered why he changed after that day, he murmured. He used to joke, sing, talk too much. But after I got hit, he was different, quieter, like he was carrying something. He ran a hand over his face, and for the first time in a long while, I saw tears gather at the edge of his eyes. I don't blame him, Raymond whispered. Not even a little. My chest tightened. War isn't clean, he continued. It's chaos. You make split-second decisions in shadows. You live with ghosts you didn't mean to make. He picked up the letter again, held it like it was something sacred. He thought he'd betrayed me, but he didn't. Not for a second. We sat in silence, the weight of everything in the room folding around us. A lifetime of service, of memory, of things never said. Then Raymond leaned back against the pillow, closed his eyes, and exhaled. Carrying this fragment all these years, it wasn't just metal, he said. It was guilt. His and mine. Yours? For making it back. I reached out and took his hand. You both made it back in some way, I said. Even if it took a little longer. He didn't answer. But I saw something in his face that hadn't been there for a long time. Peace. Raymond kept the letter close. He folded it carefully, slid it into the drawer beside his hospital bed, and didn't speak of it again for the rest of the day. But I could tell it hadn't left him. It sat with him in his breath, in the space between blinks, in the quiet turns of his gaze out the window. That night, he asked for a pen and a small notepad. He wrote slowly, deliberately, his hand shaking more from memory than from age. What are you writing? I asked gently. Just some things I want to say, he replied. To him, to myself. He didn't show me, not then. The next morning he was stronger. The nurse helped him into a chair by the window. He watched the sun rise over the parking lot, casting long gold streaks across the glass. Eddie wasn't just my friend, he said without prompting. He was like a twin I met too late in life. We shared everything. Cigarettes, jokes, fear. We even had the same scar down our arms from a barbed wire fence we thought we could climb during training. I smiled. I'd never heard that story before. He told me once, Raymond continued, that surviving war wasn't about being brave, it was about being lucky, and then learning how to live with the luck. He paused. Funny thing is, we both came home, but I think he never made it out. Not really. His voice cracked on the last word. He carried that moment for the rest of his life, I said. And you carried the piece of it inside you. He looked over at me, his expression soft but fierce. I don't want this letter to end in a drawer. What do you mean? I want to take it to his family, he said. Whoever's left. They deserve to know, not the guilt, but the truth, that he was a good man, that I never blamed him, that I loved him. My throat tightened again like it had a dozen times since this all began. That's a good idea, I said. A healing one. He smiled, faint but real. I think it's time. That afternoon, after his rest, I helped him dress. He moved slower, more carefully, but his hands were steady. Before we left the room, he held the letter again, pressing it flat between his palms like a benediction. Funny how something so small can hold so much, he said. Like a bullet, I added. Or forgiveness, he replied. He placed the letter in a new envelope, wrote a name on it, Eleanor Hart, and tucked it into his coat pocket. Later that evening, back at home, he told me more about Eddie, about the time they spent on leave in Da Nang, eating something called mystery stew from a street vendor, about the book they both swore they'd write someday, about the nights they sang Creedence Clearwater Revival into the jungle, trying to scare off ghosts with sound. It was the first time he spoke of those days without bitterness, the first time the memories sounded like something whole instead of something broken. Before bed, he looked at me and said, You know, maybe the war didn't end when I left Vietnam. Maybe it ended when that letter came out of the box. I nodded. And maybe, I added, you're finally coming home. We found her in Colorado. Eleanor Hart, a public record search, a few phone calls to veterans organizations, and one very helpful man from Eddie's old battalion who still remembered both their names. It turned out she lived in a small town just outside Boulder. A nurse, divorced, 2 grown children, and as far as we could tell, the only living descendant of Eddie Hart. Raymond insisted on making the trip in person. This isn't something you say over the phone, he told me. We drove through the mountains under a pale blue sky, the snow melting in streaks along the edges of the road. Raymond sat in silence most of the way, the letter tucked safely inside his coat pocket, folded like something holy. When we reached her house, a modest one-story with a porch full of wind chimes, Raymond asked me to wait in the car. I need to do this alone, he said. I watched him walk to the door, steady but slow, his coat buttoned all the way up. He knocked once, twice. A woman answered. Late 40s, early 50s. She looked like Eddie in the eyes. I knew instantly. She didn't invite him in right away. There was a moment, cautious, uncertain, before she stepped onto the porch. They spoke quietly. I couldn't hear the words, just saw the movements. Raymond handed her the envelope. Her hand hovered over it for a moment before taking it. She opened it there, right on the porch. I saw her shoulders tense, then fall. She sat down in a wicker chair, reading. Raymond remained standing, hands in his pockets, watching her like someone who had waited too long for something he wasn't sure he deserved. She read the letter once, then again, then pressed it to her chest and closed her eyes. When she looked up at him, her face was wet. I got out of the car, slowly, unsure if I should come closer. But Eleanor nodded to me, just once, and I knew I was welcome. I always wondered, she said when I joined them. Her voice was thick. My dad, he was a good man, but quiet, withdrawn, sometimes angry. He'd sit at the table at night just staring at nothing. Raymond sat beside her. I think he was afraid, she continued. Afraid we'd see something in him he didn't understand. He carried more than most, Raymond said, and none of it was his to carry alone. She looked at him, eyes sharp now through the tears. He never told me. Not once. He didn't want to burden you, Raymond replied. He thought silence was a kind of kindness. She laughed bitterly. Silence was a wall. Raymond nodded. I know that wall, he said. I lived behind it too. The three of us sat on Eleanor's porch long after the sun had dipped behind the mountains. Wind chimes clinked softly in the breeze, each note sounding like a fragment of memory carried on the air. She kept the letter in her lap. Her fingers curled gently around the paper's edge, like she was holding on to something delicate, something sacred. He was a good father, she said after a long pause, but distant. It always felt like part of him was locked up somewhere far away. Raymond nodded. That part was still in Vietnam. Eleanor wiped at her eyes. I never imagined it was guilt. I just thought, maybe he didn't love us the way other fathers did. He did, Raymond said. In his own way. He loved you by staying, by showing up every day, even if he didn't have all the pieces of himself to give. She looked at him. And you? Are you angry after what he wrote? Raymond didn't answer right away. He leaned back in the chair, eyes drifting across the treetops. Then he said, I'm not angry. I never was. She blinked, confused. You didn't know until now, she said. He smiled faintly, but even before the letter, I'd forgiven whatever had happened. I just didn't know what it was. War doesn't come with clarity, only consequences. He paused. And besides, you don't forgive someone you love. Not really. You just love them through it. Eleanor's face softened, her features folding into something between sorrow and understanding. He would have wanted to hear that, she whispered. I think he did, Raymond replied. They sat in silence again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full of release, of things finally spoken, of grief that had found a name. Eventually, Eleanor stood and disappeared into the house. She returned a few minutes later with a small wooden box carved with the Marine Corps insignia. My dad kept this in his closet, she said, handing it to Raymond. I never opened it. Thought it was his to carry, but now I think maybe part of it belongs to you. Raymond opened the box slowly. Inside were a few medals, an old photo of two young soldiers leaning against a tank, and a folded American flag. He stared at the items for a long time, then closed the lid gently. Thank you, he said, but keep it. That's your father's story. I just needed to give you this page of it. She looked at the letter in her lap. I'll keep it safe, she promised. I'll tell my kids. They should know who he really was. Raymond nodded, and for a brief moment, his eyes shimmered, not from sadness, but from something quieter. A closing, a homecoming. As we stood to leave, Eleanor hugged him tightly, resting her head on his shoulder like a daughter might. Thank you for coming, she said, for telling the truth, for giving me back a piece of him I thought I'd lost. You gave me something too, Raymond said, a place to lay him down. And with that, the last piece of Eddie Hart found its way home. The box was small, no bigger than a jewelry case, but inside it sat the thing that had nearly killed Raymond twice, once by blood, once by silence. He opened the lid one last time at the kitchen table. The fragment rested on a white felt square, alongside a copy of Eddie's letter, now laminated and preserved. Raymond looked at it the way you look at a gravestone, not with anger, not with fear, but with reverence. I want it to mean something, he said. It already does, I replied. But I understand. We had called the National Veterans Memorial and Museum 3 weeks earlier, told them the story. The curator, a former Army medic himself, had gone quiet for a long moment on the phone, then simply said, "Yes, we'll make room." So we drove again. Not as far this time, just across the state. But this wasn't a road trip, this was a pilgrimage. When we arrived, they greeted Raymond like a brother returning from war. No trumpets, no fanfare, just handshakes, firm and honest. A few nods from strangers who knew what it meant to carry things unseen. The museum was quiet, modern, clean lines, soft lighting, but the walls pulsed with history. Photographs, uniforms, journals, medals, ghosts with names and faces. Raymond walked slowly through the hall, paused in front of a display from Vietnam. A pair of boots, a ration kit, a poncho folded with military precision. He stared at it for a long time. "That smell," he whispered. "I can almost smell it. Rain and diesel and metal and fear." The curator led us to a small glass case in a section titled Wounds That Don't Show. There was already a Purple Heart, a field journal stained with water, and a faded photograph of 3 young men, 2 of whom hadn't made it home. "We want this to be here," the curator said. "Not because it's rare, though it is, but because it tells a different kind of story." Raymond handed him the box. "Thank you," the curator said quietly, "for all of it." They placed the memento in the case with gloved hands, set the fragment beside a plaque that read, "Memento of Forgiveness," a shrapnel fragment carried inside a soldier for 47 years. Removed in 2024, this piece traveled from shoulder to pelvis, silent and unseen, much like the weight of memory itself. Donated with a letter from a fellow soldier, whose mistake became a lifelong burden, and whose name is honored here not in shame but in love. Raymond stood before it, shoulders squared, his eyes steady. Visitors began to gather, just a few at first, a teenage boy in a baseball cap, a woman with silver hair, a man in a wheelchair who stared at the case for a long time before finally nodding. Once, one of the docents approached us afterward. "People don't come here for war stories," she said. "They come to remember peace and to understand the cost of it." Raymond nodded, and sometimes to lay something down. That night they held a small ceremony. Nothing elaborate, just a circle of chairs, a few shared stories, a reading of the plaque aloud. When it came time for Raymond to speak, he stood slowly, held onto the podium with one hand, and cleared his throat. "I carried that piece of metal inside me for almost 5 decades, he said. But what weighed more was not knowing the truth. When I finally learned what happened, that a friend, trying to protect me, had pulled the trigger that wounded me, my first feeling wasn't anger. It was sorrow, for what he lived with, for what he never said." He paused, and then I realized, maybe I wasn't meant to know back then. Maybe I was meant to carry it, until I was strong enough to let it go. His voice didn't shake. "Some wounds don't bleed, some bullets don't kill, but they all leave something behind. This is mine, and now it belongs to everyone who's ever carried something alone." There was no applause, just silence, deep, respectful. Later, as we walked toward the exit, the teenage boy approached Raymond. "My grandpa was in Nam," he said. "He never talked about it, just sat in his chair, quiet, angry sometimes. I didn't get it." Raymond looked at him. "You do now?" The boy nodded. "Yeah, a little, and that was enough." We left the museum with nothing in our hands, but everything lighter. Raymond didn't say much on the ride home. He rolled down the window, let the wind run through his fingers. When we pulled into the driveway, he turned to me and said, "I think I can sleep tonight." And he did. For the first time in a long time, he slept all the way through. Raymond sat on the porch with his grandson, Lucas, the 2 of them wrapped in blankets, sipping cocoa on a cool spring evening. The boy was 10, curious, thoughtful, and already showing signs of that same quiet intensity that had lived in his grandfather most of his life. They didn't talk much at first, just watched the sun slide down behind the tree line, listened to the chirping of birds and the soft rustle of wind through new leaves. Then Lucas broke the silence. "Grandpa," he asked, "what's that scar on your side from?" Raymond looked down, instinctively touching the spot beneath his ribs. The skin was smooth now, but the memory was never far. "That's from something I carried a long time," he said. "A piece of metal. Like shrapnel?" "Exactly like that. Did it hurt?" Raymond smiled gently. "Not all the time. But when it did, it reminded me of things I thought I'd forgotten." Lucas was quiet for a moment. Then, with the blunt honesty only children possess, he asked, "Did you ever kill anyone?" Raymond didn't flinch. He looked at the boy, measured the weight of the question, and answered with care. I don't know, he said. I shot when I was told to. I fired into jungles, into places where enemies were hiding. I did what soldiers do, but I never looked in anyone's eyes and watched the light go out. So I don't know. Lucas seemed to consider that. Does it make you sad? Yes, Raymond said. It makes me sad that we had to do those things. But it also makes me proud that I came home and tried to be better. That I raised a family. That I helped people. That I didn't let the war be the only thing that defined me. Lucas nodded slowly. Is that why your thing's in the museum? Raymond chuckled. Yeah, that's why. Mom showed me the picture, the piece of metal, and the letter. Raymond looked at him surprised. She told you? Lucas shrugged. Not all the details. Just that it was from a friend, and that you forgave him. Raymond leaned back in his chair. She's right. I did forgive him. Lucas hesitated, then asked, was it hard? Raymond thought for a long moment before answering. No, he said finally. What was hard was not knowing. Once I knew, the forgiveness was the easy part. Lucas fiddled with the edge of his blanket. Will you tell me the story someday? Raymond smiled. I just did. That night, Lucas asked if he could sleep over. He curled up on the couch with the dog at his feet, and Raymond sat nearby, watching over him as he drifted off to sleep. He thought about all the things he'd left behind in the jungle, friends, innocence, the old version of himself. But he also thought about everything he'd carried home. Grit, grace, and something else even harder to define. Survival, not just the physical kind, but the emotional kind. The kind that lets you sit beside your grandson decades later and answer his questions with honesty instead of shame. The next morning, Lucas asked if they could go to the museum together one day. I want to see the letter in person, he said. Raymond nodded. We'll go. And I'll tell you about Eddie, about how brave he was, about what it means to live with something hard, and to keep living anyway. And in that moment, Raymond knew the story wouldn't end with him. It would live on, in curious questions, in honest answers, in the quiet porch nights shared between an old man and a young boy who would one day carry forward not the war, but the wisdom. Sometimes what we carry in our hearts is heavier than any shrapnel lodged in the body. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting, it's about choosing to keep living without letting old pain define who we are. The story of Raymond and Eddie isn't just about war. It's a reminder to all of us that truth, no matter how long it takes, can still heal. What about you? Have you ever witnessed or lived through something where only forgiveness brought peace? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your story. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next powerful journey.